I set my coffee down on the porch railing and watched the sun come up over the Gulf. 65 years old. And this was the first morning in a long time I didn't have somewhere I had to be. The beach house sat on a quiet stretch of Pensacola coastline. 3 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and enough distance from the city that the only traffic I heard was the tide. I had earned every square foot of it. Not by luck. Not by inheritance. By 20 years of getting up before dawn and working until my hands ached. That morning felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. I just didn't know yet that both were true. My name is Gerald. I spent the better part of 4 decades building custom homes across the Florida Panhandle. Started with nothing but a truck, a used nail gun, and a contractor's license I studied for at night while my daughter slept in the next room. Her mother had passed when my daughter was 7, and it had been the 2 of us ever since. I coached her softball. I drove her to every school play rehearsal. I walked her to the bus stop until she told me, firmly, at age 12, that she was old enough to walk alone. I laughed about that for a week. Her name is Claire. She was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. Sharp, funny, loyal. When she was 23, she met a man named Derek at a work conference in Atlanta. He was smooth. I'll give him that. Good handshake, good eye contact. Always said the right thing, at exactly the right moment. The first time I met him, I smiled and shook his hand and told Claire afterward that something about him sat wrong with me. She said I was being overprotective. Maybe I was. I let it go. They married 18 months later. I gave her away at the altar, and I meant it in every sense, though I didn't know then just how completely she would disappear. Derek worked in financial consulting. He traveled constantly, or said he did. Within a year of the wedding, Claire had left her job at the marketing firm she loved and moved with him to Charlotte, then to Denver, then back to Charlotte. Each move pulled her a little further from anything familiar. She stopped calling as often. When she did call, she sounded careful, measured, like she was choosing each word before she said it. I noticed, but I told myself it was just the adjustment of a new marriage, a new life. Then one Thanksgiving I drove 6 hours to Charlotte to surprise her. I had called ahead. She had said they were staying home that year. I thought I'd bring the meal to her. Derek answered the door and told me it wasn't a good time. Claire appeared behind him in the hallway, and the look on her face wasn't surprise. It was fear. Not of me, of him, standing between us. I didn't understand it then. I asked if I could come in. Derek said Claire needed space from the pressure of family expectations, that I needed to respect their boundaries as a couple, and then he closed the door. I stood on that porch in the November cold for a long moment before I walked back to my truck. After that, the communication slowed to almost nothing. A text on my birthday, brief and formal. A Christmas card with no personal note. Just their names printed by a machine. When Claire was pregnant with their daughter, I found out through a cousin who had seen it on social media. I sent a card and a gift and got a 2-line thank you in return. By the time my granddaughter Emma was born, I was already a stranger to my own family. I tried for 3 years. Letters Derek never answered, phone calls that went to voicemail. One more drive to Charlotte that ended with Derek threatening to call the police if I came back. I hired a family attorney who told me that without evidence of abuse, there was little legal recourse. Claire was an adult, making her own choices, even if those choices were being made for her, so I stopped. Not because I gave up on Claire, but because I understood something that took me a long time to accept. You cannot reach someone through a wall someone else built around them. You can only wait and stay ready and make sure that when the wall finally cracks, you are still standing on the other side. I threw myself into work. I bought a small parcel of land in 2009 when prices collapsed and built 3 rental units on it. Then 4 more. Then a small commercial strip. I reinvested every dollar. I hired good people and trusted them. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and drove the same truck for 11 years and said nothing to anyone about what was accumulating quietly in my accounts and properties. By the time I was 63, the portfolio was worth just over $14 million. I sold the construction company to my foreman for a fair price, bought the beach house outright, and moved in on a Tuesday with 2 suitcases and a box of books. The only person I stayed in contact with, carefully and secretly, was Emma. She had found me herself. She was 14 when she sent me a message through an old email address that Claire must have mentioned at some point. The message said, "Grandpa Gerald, I don't know if you remember me. Mom doesn't talk about you, but I found some pictures. I wanted to say hi. Please, don't tell my dad." I read that message 6 times before I could answer it. I kept my response short and warm, and I told her that I remembered her every single day. We wrote back and forth for 2 years. She was careful, deleting the messages after I confirmed I'd read them, always writing from the school library or a friend's house. She told me things in those emails that I didn't repeat to anyone. Things about the way Derek spoke to Claire behind closed doors, the way money disappeared and bills went unpaid while Derek drove new cars, the way Claire had started to seem, in Emma's words, like a person who forgot she used to be happy. I read those emails and I built a file. Quietly. A folder on my laptop that grew over 22 months. I shared nothing with Emma about what I was doing. I just listened and documented and waited. I had been in the beach house for 4 months when my cell phone rang on a Wednesday evening. It was a number I didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end was Claire's. She sounded like she was calling from the bottom of a well. She said Derek had made some bad investments. She said they were behind on the mortgage. Behind on everything. She said she had found out about certain things she wouldn't name over the phone. Her voice broke once, and she pulled it back together. Then she asked if they could come stay with me for a while, just until they sorted things out. Just temporarily. I told her I would love to see her. I told her to come. What I did not tell her was that I had already spoken to my attorney 2 days before, and that the folder on my laptop had been forwarded to 2 people who would know exactly what to do with it. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in a car I didn't recognize, which I later found out was a rental because their BMW had been repossessed the previous week. Derek stepped out first, straightening his jacket, scanning the property with the kind of look a man uses when he's calculating square footage. Claire got out on the other side, and I felt something move in my chest when I saw her. She was thinner than I remembered. She walked with her shoulders forward, like she was trying to take up less space. Emma climbed out of the back seat and looked at me with eyes that were older than 16 had any right to be. I walked down the porch steps, and I hugged Claire first. She held on longer than I expected, and I felt her exhale slowly, like she had been holding her breath for 18 years. Derek shook my hand and said the house was impressive. Said he was glad we were finally getting the chance to reconnect as a family. Said he knew things had been difficult between us in the past, but he hoped we could put all of that behind us now. He said it the way people say things they've rehearsed. I smiled and told him I was glad they came. Emma hugged me last, and she held on tight and whispered something against my shoulder. I caught only one word. Ready. That was the signal we had arranged. I had coached Emma carefully in those 2 years of emails. Not to lie, not to spy, not to do anything that put her at risk, only to tell me honestly what was happening, and to use that one word when she felt the time was right. I had told her that when she used it, things might change quickly, and she needed to trust me and stay calm. She had written back, "Okay, Grandpa, I trust you." We had dinner on the porch, grilled fish, sweet corn, everything. Derek complimented with the enthusiasm of someone who needed something. Halfway through the meal, he began to explain their situation more fully. The investments hadn't panned out. There were some legal complications, nothing serious, just paperwork. They needed a stable base for a while. The beach house clearly had plenty of room. He was sure we could work something out. Claire said nothing. She moved food around her plate and looked at the water. I asked Derek to tell me more about the legal complications. He smiled tightly and said it was boring financial stuff. Nothing worth getting into over dinner. I said I had a lot of experience with financial matters, and I was happy to help if he wanted to talk through it. He changed the subject. After Emma went to bed, Derek got to the point. He said he'd been thinking, and since I had clearly done well for myself and since we were family, it only made sense for him and Claire to move in for the foreseeable future. He would help with upkeep. He had some business ideas he'd been developing, and a property like this could be useful for client meetings. He needed access to a certain amount of working capital to get things moving again, something he was sure we could structure as a family loan. Informal, flexible terms. He said all of this while leaning back in his chair like a man discussing an arrangement he had already decided was settled. I said I needed to sleep on it. He didn't like that. His smile stayed in place, but his eyes changed. He said he was sure I understood the urgency of the situation. I said I did. Then I said good night and went inside. The next morning I called my attorney, my accountant, and a man named Ray who had worked financial fraud investigations for the state of Florida for 21 years before retiring and consulting privately. Ray had been reviewing Derek's financial trail for 4 months by then. He told me what he had found was enough, and that the 2 people he had connected with were ready to move when I gave the word. I gave the word. I also called the family law attorney. I had retained the previous month and confirmed the guardianship paperwork was prepared and waiting. Derek spent Saturday morning walking the property, measuring things with his eyes. Claire sat with me on the porch for an hour, and we talked about small things at first, cautious things. And then she asked me in a very quiet voice why I had stopped reaching out. I told her I had never stopped. I told her what had happened the last time I tried to visit, and I watched her face as I spoke. She didn't contradict me. She just nodded slowly, like someone who was finally hearing the name of something they had suspected for a long time. I told her I needed her to do something for me before dinner that evening. I told her what it was. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she had actually been holding on to certain documents herself, things she had photographed on her phone over the past few months, things she had been too scared to show anyone. I told her I knew a good place those documents could go. She sent them to my email before noon. Sunday evening, I had invited 3 neighbors over for a casual dinner on the porch. Nothing formal. Derek accepted this. With visible irritation, he tried to mask his patience. One of the neighbors was a retired circuit court judge named Paul, who had become a friend when I moved in. Another was a woman named Sandra, who had been a licensed social worker for 30 years. The third was Ray. I introduced them by their first names and described them only as neighbors and friends. Dinner was easy and warm, and Derek worked the table like he always worked a room, charming and attentive and watching for angles. Emma sat beside me and ate quietly, and once she caught my eye across the table and nodded just slightly. After the plates were cleared and the wine was poured, Ray asked Derek what kind of consulting work he did these days. Derek gave his standard answer. Ray asked a few follow-up questions, still friendly, still conversational. Derek's answers grew shorter. Then Ray set a folder on the table and slid it across and asked if Derek recognized the account numbers listed on the first page. The porch went very quiet. Derek pushed his chair back and stood up and said this was inappropriate, that he didn't know who these people were, that he wasn't going to sit here and be ambushed in someone else's home. He turned to me, and his voice went low, and he said, I had made a serious mistake. I told him to sit down. He didn't expect that. The calmness of it. Maybe. I said it again. The same way. And he sat. Ray explained, still quietly, that the account activity documented in the folder represented a pattern consistent with the unauthorized transfer of assets from a joint marital account in violation of 2 specific statutes he named precisely. He explained that the information had been provided to the appropriate office 10 days earlier, and that Derek's accounts had been frozen as of that morning. He explained that 2 individuals from that office were currently parked at the end of my driveway and had been waiting politely for the dinner to reach this point. Derek looked at Claire. Claire was looking at the table. He looked at me. I looked back at him and said nothing. He tried once more. Said it was all a misunderstanding, that Claire had agreed to those transfers, that he could explain everything if people would just calm down and be reasonable. Claire raised her eyes then and said, very clearly, that she had agreed to nothing. I walked to the porch door and opened it, and nodded toward the driveway. They came in professionally and quietly, and explained to Derek that he would need to come with them to answer some questions. Derek stood stiffly and let them put the handcuffs on without a struggle, which surprised me, but Paul, who had seen this many times, told me later that men like Derek always go quiet when the thing they most feared actually arrives. Emma watched from the porch doorway. She did not cry. She stood straight and watched her father leave, and then she came and sat beside me at the table and took my hand and held it. Claire stayed at the table for a long time after the cars pulled away. The neighbors gave her space and said their good nights kindly. Sandra stayed an extra hour and sat with her. Not pushing, just present. I brought tea and sat on the far end of the porch and let them talk. It was almost midnight when Sandra left. Claire came and sat beside me, and we watched the Gulf for a while without talking. The water was dark, and the lights on the horizon were shrimp boats working the night. She said she didn't know where to start. I told her she didn't have to start anywhere tonight. She said she was sorry. She said it 3 times. I let her say it, and I didn't rush past it with reassurances, because she needed to say it, and I needed to hear it. Then I told her the truth, which was that I had known for a long time that what happened to our relationship wasn't something she had chosen freely, and that the only thing that mattered to me now was what came next. She asked what came next. I told her I had spoken to a family law attorney, that the guardianship documents for Emma were drawn up and ready to be signed, establishing my home as Emma's primary residence while everything sorted itself out. That this gave Emma stability regardless of what happened with the legal proceedings or with Claire's own next steps. That it was not a move against Claire, it was a net underneath Emma. And if Claire wanted to be here too while she figured things out, the house had room. Claire nodded for a long time. Then she said she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone think 3 steps ahead on her behalf. I told her I had been thinking those steps for 18 years. I just hadn't been close enough to use them. The legal process took 14 months. Derek was charged with financial fraud, unauthorized transfer of marital assets, and 2 additional counts related to activity that came to light once investigators had access to his records. He pleaded guilty to 3 of the 4 charges and was sentenced to 4 years. The details were not satisfying in the way revenge stories are sometimes supposed to be. There was no dramatic courtroom moment, no speech, no final look across a room. There was just paperwork, and dates, and the slow machinery of consequence. Claire stayed in the beach house through all of it. She got a job at a local design firm 3 months after arriving, a field she had left when Derek decided her income wasn't necessary. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it. And watching her figure that out again was something I didn't have a word for. Emma started at the high school in January of that year. She was sharp and self-possessed and made friends quickly. She told me in February that she wanted to study environmental law. I told her that sounded exactly right for someone who had spent her childhood learning about systems that were supposed to protect people but didn't. She laughed and said I was being intense. I told her she had a grandfather who had been saving up intensity for 18 years and she would have to bear with me. She told me I wasn't allowed to be sentimental before school. I told her that was fair. There was a morning in March, about 5 months after Derek left in handcuffs, when I was on the porch with my coffee, and Claire came out in her robe with her own cup and sat down across from me. The sun was coming up the same way it had been the morning. All of this started. The Gulf was flat and pink at the edges. She asked me something I hadn't expected. She asked how I had stayed so calm through all of it. The dinner, the confrontation, all of it. She said she had been watching my face, and I had looked like a man reading a familiar book. I thought about it. I told her the truth, which was that I had spent 18 years imagining every version of how it might go wrong and every version of how it might go right. And by the time it actually happened, I had already lived through it so many times in my head that I was just following a path I had already walked 1,000 times in the dark. She was quiet. Then she said that was either the wisest or the saddest thing she had ever heard. I told her it was probably both. What I didn't tell her, because some things don't translate well into words, was that the calm hadn't come from certainty. It had come from something simpler. For 18 years, I had kept one thing steady. I had remained someone worth coming back to. I had not grown bitter in ways that would have poisoned the reunion. I had not hardened into someone Claire and Emma would have found strange and cold when they finally arrived. That had been the real work. Not the financial planning. Not the legal preparation. Not the strategy. The real work had been tending to what I was on the inside, quietly, with no audience, for a very long time. The beach house had 4 chairs on the porch. On good evenings, all 4 of them were occupied. That, in the end, was the only number that mattered.